A further deterioration in human rights in Mali amid rising insecurity and a crackdown on civil society. It comes 5 years after the military overthrew the country's democratically elected president. Joining us now is Seif Magango, spokesperson for the UN Human Rights Office, to discuss the latest developments and what they mean for ordinary Malians. Seif, thank you for joining us. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has warned of a worsening human rights situation in Mali. Can you explain what's driving this deterioration?
Well, the Malian civilians are caught between a rock and a hard place, to put it very simply. They are faced with an armed insurgency, two armed groups, Janim and ISIS in the Sahel, who are fighting an armed conflict with the armed forces of the state of Mali. And we've received reports and corroborated many of them of killings by both sides, the armed forces as well, backed by the by foreign fighters, formerly of the Wagner Group, now called Africa Corps, as well as the Janim and ISIS. So the right to life of the civilians in parts of Mali is quite concerning. But not only that, since the military took over, there's been an increase in extrajudicial killings and forced disappearances. There's been a huge crackdown on the right to the freedom of the press. There's been a lot of there's been a shrinking of civil society as a result of the government perhaps just basically taking that as the cause to silence dissent. All of these are very concerning things that we hope will come to an end very soon.
What has the UN documented in terms of those extrajudicial killings, the arbitrary arrests or disappearances that you speak of, since Malian troops and foreign forces have put serious abuses against the Malian people?
Yeah, no, there are many to recount. We get reports regularly of villages attacked in many places. There are attacks coming from Bamako towards these central and these areas of armed conflict. There are attacks coming from Menaka by these armed groups. But also, just to really touch on one thing, there is another really interesting development that took place very fairly recently. The interim president, the transitional president of Mali, the leader of the coup, a few years ago, decided to sign a law recently that would pretty much do away with elections. There's not going to be elections in Mali until they say the security is improved in the country. So we worry about the democratic reversals that have taken place now in the context of, if the people cannot express themselves through the ballot, how are their rights going to be upheld going forward?
And let's talk about then those recent laws that also allow the president to remain in power indefinitely and have dissolved all political parties. How do those changes affect ordinary Malians and their democratic rights?
Well, you can imagine if in the country where you are, they woke up one day and said there's not going to be elections anymore for whatever reason. That would pretty much take away your right as a citizen of that country to participate in the public affairs of your country. You're left to the devices of those in power. And this is a fundamental right under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Every citizen must have the right to participate in public affairs of their country, to be voted for, and to vote people who will represent them. It is absolutely unacceptable that the authorities choose. They came to power, remember, 5 years ago, put in place a transitional government with, as it states in the name, they were a transitional government. They were supposed to subsequently return power to civilians and to hold elections. They've been postponing these elections indefinitely, and now they have completely decided there's not going to be elections in the country until they decide that they should return to electoral democracy. But it seems that that will not be happening in a long time from now. And that's why we are calling on the transitional authorities in Mali to revoke those laws, because they have no place in this day and age.
The former Prime Minister Moussa Mara and other activists have been detained for speaking out. Is there a sense of that this is a concern to the Malian troops, to the armed groups like JNIM and Islamic State, or it's just the rest of the world that sees the concern of this trend for freedom of expression in Mali?
Well, there can be no way to vindicate people's rights if people are deprived of all ways that they can express themselves on very legitimate issues. The former prime minister only tweeted to bring attention to these changes and calling on the authorities to reconsider, and he ended up being arrested. And he's not the only one. We've seen a lot of people who speak up, human rights defenders, journalists, lawyers, who attempt to speak up, speaking up on the issues of public concern, things that are protected under the right to freedom of expression, being arrested and accused of undermining the state and on very broad brush terms. And they're being held for indefinite periods unduly. And that's why we are making the call today for everyone who is detained arbitrarily to be immediately released. We've also seen cases besides that of people being picked up in broad daylight in the streets and disappeared and detained in undesignated places. I think there has to, the time has come for the military authorities in Mali to reassess their tactics that are contrary to human rights guarantees that they have signed up to under the UN treaties, and to really respect people's human rights and stop these extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, arbitrary arrests, and such like.
As these problematic laws are in place in Mali, the UN is calling for them to be revoked. What would it take for that process to happen? And what is the UN saying in terms of concrete measures to tackle these problematic laws?
Well, the one concrete measure is for the president to rescind this law, for it to be rescinded, because it violates Mali's own constitutional obligations and the international human rights treaty obligations. It's definitely within the Malian authorities' powers through parliament to rescind and walk back this law and make sure it's no longer there. They need to return to the framework that they had pledged to stick to. The framework to return Mali to democratic civilian rule.
You note as the UN as well that there's intimidation of civilians in Mali, a looting of property as well. What should be done on that front by armed groups?
Well, the armed groups must stop, full stop. That is the end of it. They need to stop carrying out these serious violations of international law, not only because it's wrong, but also they need to be aware that there will be justice. There will be justice. To do this, there'll be repercussions. They will face justice, if not in Mali, at least in international settings. The other thing is that the Malian state authorities have to investigate every attack on civilians, every killing, every injury, every every act of looting, all these could amount to serious to war crimes that the state of Mali must investigate and ensure that justice is done, hold those responsible to account.
What are the chances then that that would happen within Mali, the investigation of abuses and then the perpetrators being held accountable if the international community does not step in?
Well, the international community is stepping in by calling attention to these issues and putting the authorities on notice that we are watching. We totally appreciate the challenges they face trying to deal with the armed conflict and the insurgencies taking place in the country. But dealing with an armed insurgency and human rights are not mutually exclusive. We're calling on them to do what is within their power and take meaningful steps to ensure that human rights and international humanitarian law is respected in this context. Mali is not a lawless state. There is a government in place. It might be a military government that came into effect through a coup that promised to have a transition that would lead back to democratic government, but it is nonetheless a government that is in control of the territory of Mali. It is incumbent upon them to take steps to address the shortcomings in respect for human rights in their territory. And it's never too late to do the right thing. What we've seen over the last couple of months, many media houses being shut down, political parties being disbanded, the elections being permanently, indefinitely called off. All these things can be reversed if there is goodwill from the authorities. And we believe that in a spirit of constructive dialogue, and they are able and can take steps to address the situation as it stands.
Seif, thanks again for your time. We'll leave it there for today. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Seif Magango, spokesperson for the UN Human Rights Office, highlighting the growing human rights concerns in Mali. 7 o'clock.